No, here we go.
Oh.
Okay, so hello, my name is Miguel Rivera. I'm the student co-chair of EduCon and junior at Science Shaper Academy. First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you for joining us this weekend. We hope this weekend will be a great experience for you, full of conversations, discovery, and ways to strengthen the education system in all of our communities. When I was a student in middle school, I was taught to complete my classwork, take exams, and I asked my questions about the way I learned. Education was about a grade and how my grade compared to others. SLA had changed what it means to be a student and grades for myself and so many others. Education is now more about being creative and asking questions, trying new things with the chance of making mistakes, but accepting and learning from those mistakes. I am no longer seen as a GPA or test score, but a valued, trusted member, part of this community. I have been given the opportunity to be a leader in my school. I co-lead Latino Club, where we celebrate Latino histories and cultures. And I also co-lead Community Development Club, where we try to help people throughout the city. SLA helped me find a summer mentorship program at UPenn that I would never know without them. I'm able to do all of this due to the community at SLA and our core values of inquiry, research, collaboration, presentation, and reflection. SLA is a community where teachers are willing to help students inside and outside the classroom. Our teachers are willing to get to know you as a person and work with you to achieve great things. I am taught that I should take control and pride in my education. I'm also surrounded by amazing peers who are caring and creative in their own unique ways. My fellow peers teach me about different cultures and ways of lives. These are just a few things that SLA have shown me, and I hope you're able to experience the same amazing SLA that I know and love. Again, thank you for being with us this weekend. Now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for tonight's panel, former SLA teacher, Connected Ed Fellow at the U.S. Department of Education, and current Language Arts Coordinator at St. Vern Valley School, and all-around nice guy. Vic Chase. Zach Chase, sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Miguel. I want to, before we get started and talk about the panel, I think a round of applause for the students who led tours, the students who were on cameras and audio for Miguel. I'm sure at some point in time tonight we will talk about authenticity and learning experiences, and so I just wanted to set that down there right now. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Great. So are we. So just a couple of notes. We will not be doing Curiosity 101 this evening. So the question, I've warned our panelists, we will not be saying, what is curiosity? We'll also not be doing, why is curiosity important? So if you're coming for those particular answers, you're out of luck. So let me introduce our panel very quickly. Immediately here, we have Stephanie Sandifer, who says, for nearly her entire career, she's been involved in work that required educators to reimagine what school could and should look and feel like. From her early years as a baby educator, when I knew so little but quickly became involved in leading a comprehensive school redesign initiative, to her more recent experience of designing a mobile personalized school from scratch. From working to implement project/problem-based learning to developing a place-based personalized model where students' interests and passions were incorporated into the learning environment on a daily basis. She has actually had very little time spent in a mostly traditional learning environment. Even outside of her own work, her own children, who are now in 2nd and 4th grades, attended a child development center based on Reggio Emilia, which follows the curiosity of the child from birth until 3 years old, and have been attending a public Montessori school since pre-K through 3. And immediately to her left, we have Antero Garcia, who is excited here to jump in and talk about the work that he's been doing in classrooms and around designing and studying games and play with teachers and students. He also brings to this work his work with the National Writing Project, the George Lucas Foundation, his work as a classroom teacher, and his work training and preparing classroom teachers. So if there's anything to be done around a teacher, Antero's done it at some point in time. To Antero's left, we have Franz Davis. You've heard. She doesn't know about any of you, but she can't for the life of herself think of a time in her own schooling where curiosity was encouraged. For most of her childhood and some of her adult years, to be honest, she felt as if she was living in her head. She asked questions, she wondered, she still does. However, those wonderings happened only in her head. Culturally speaking, if she seemed too inquisitive, it was intimidating to others as well as damaging to her in how she would be treated. Her mother told her every day not to let people know how smart she was, but it wasn't because she wanted her to be shrinking violet. She wanted to protect her in a world that didn't seem to welcome people like her to be smart. For years in her community, she was right. No one looked at the affluent white kid and questioned if their thoughts were their own, but those questions were asked of her and other non-gifted labeled students of color all the time. She thinks that's essentially why she's the way she is now in advocating for creativity and curiosity. She still lives through the damage of curiosity oppression. So whether continuously encouraging her own children and working to break barriers in her community, it all goes back to the reality of living in a world where, true to her mother's words, people are not going to allow you to be smart, so keep your thoughts to yourself and don't let people know what you know. Yeah, it's real. Just none of that silly stuff tonight. And finally, rounding out our wonderful conversation is Milton Chen. A unique experience he brings is that he has worked on children's TV series that tried to provoke curiosity, starting with Sesame Street. And some of you might remember the science show on PBS called 3-2-1 Contact in the early 80s.
Yeah.
Right?
You all were in the target audience. You were children. I was working on the show, yeah.
I have some specific MathNet questions,
Yeah.
but we're going to hold off on that.
We can get to that.
He worked on it, and the original title was The Curiosity Show. Yeah, right? They did a formative research study asking 8 to 12-year-olds to tell them questions they had asked, either to themselves or adults. They could have built the entire show around their questions, which fell into 5 categories: their bodies, the weather, animals, how things are made, how things work. Their phrasing was also interesting. How does my body know when it's time to grow? How do animals talk? So welcome our panel. So when I get started, I should also say it seemed wrong that in a panel about curiosity, we would section off question and answer to the end of the conversation. So I have Twitter open up here. If you push a question out to Twitter, I will be watching and the EduCon hashtag, and we'll be able to work those in as we go along. So I want to ask folks if you could get started. What are you curious about right now as adults?
A million things. So I live and work in Houston, Texas, and we've got a lot of issues right now. If you're familiar with any of the news, especially the news that came out this week about our district, we've got a serious situation with budget and equity and possible takeover of the district. And how to solve all these problems in a very short amount of time so that we can retain control of the district and move forward with, we've got some really good work happening in Houston, but how do we move forward with that in light of these major issues? And then there was this little thing called Harvey that hit and caused a lot of problems down there with some of our schools. So for me, I'm curious about how to continue to advocate for and push for more innovation, and I believe we're going to talk about this on the panel tonight. Innovation that is done in an equitable way, at the same point in time that we're addressing some very serious and real concerns in our district.
I think all of us are probably similarly thinking about issues of equity in terms of what is driving us in terms of our curiosity. The research that I've been doing lately, or at least some of the research I've been doing lately, has been thinking about how do the ways we prepare kids in schools ultimately prepare them or not prepare them outside of schools, right? And in particular, the kinds of civic identities of young people is of particular curiosity to me right now. And so when I say civics, I mean the ways that young people, when they leave our schools, are able to enact change outside of our schools. Oftentimes when we talk about civics, people assume that it is tied to things like voting. It is tied to a certain type of student who is legally or not legally allowed to vote, right? And I want to make sure that we are expansive and curious in how we define civics collectively, both in schools and out of schools. So as I say that, what I'm hoping to have a conversation around as part of this is my curiosity is, if we look at the mess of the 2016 election, if we look at the ways that people are not able to talk with one another, if we look at where political discourse for adults is, right? Now is a moment for young people's creativity and ingenuity to lead to different kinds of social change. And I'm curious what kinds of solutions we could think about in terms of sustaining those conversations in schools to begin with.
I think for me to almost piggyback off of both of yours, my own personal experiences probably defines a lot of the work that I do, as Zach kind of read earlier. But I have a nephew who is 13 and at 8 taught himself how to make puppets and paint and mold and all kinds of crazy, insane things. And when I watch him he asks questions naturally. He wants to figure things out and he just does it. And I look at what he does, and it's not easy to replicate in a school. So how do we create spaces for kids to dig into the areas that they want to learn more about and they want to have agency around, in spaces where there's so many barriers that are sometimes mental, sometimes absolute barriers that we are not going to change in our public school system, so that we're not having to send our kids to different types of schools to get those experiences? How do we bring them into that environment that we know we can't change, but yet we need that change to happen?
Great.
Yeah, my answer is very consistent with what's been said, that I'm kind of curious about how can we change the system, and therefore how can we change the things that the system prizes as far as evidence of learning. You've just given a marvelous example of a curious young person who's taught himself some things. We're living in that age when kids can do this, but would that be accepted by a college? Would that be accepted by a high school? This is evidence of learning when there's still so much tied to transcripts and tests and grades. So I'm very curious about the movement to change assessments, to change what we value. I'm always glad to hear of colleges who are saying, we're not going to just look at your grades. We want to see evidence of what you can actually do. So the sooner that happens, the better. I think we've been at this a long time amongst this panel, trying to change education, but the most important thing to me is really changing assessments.
So let's get to the equity question first. Curiosity is free, right? Creating space for curiosity is free. So why, when we visit some of our kind of schools with the highest level of low socioeconomic status students living in poverty, why do we see so little curiosity when it is free? Or not little curiosity, little encouragement and mining of that curiosity. And then we see our better resourced schools where students who are not living at the same rates of poverty, that curiosity seems to be much more pronounced and accepted and encouraged. And how do we reframe that? How do we start to say, no, curiosity, we don't need to buy 100 more robots, but we could start asking these things now.
Can I actually that?
Yeah.
So I actually don't think curiosity is free, right? Like I think there's a real cost that we should acknowledge if we think about curiosity. In that, I'm thinking of some colleagues at UCLA, John Rogers and Nicole Mira, did a study of out-of-school time of kids across Los Angeles, and looked at during summer how do kids spend their time. And it was really, they had surveys, and it was very simple for kids to keep a diary of what they did during their summertime, right? And spoiler alert, the kids who come from more affluent backgrounds were able to sign up for classes that sparked and sustained creativity, and the kids who didn't get those same kinds of opportunities, right? That there was a clear financial connection to what creativity, to the opportunities for creativity, right? We also think about urban youth who are creative, and the ways that creativity might be demonstrated could be seen as detrimental. In fact, there is like a real life cost to that. And I think about the young man Ahmed a few years ago who went viral for bringing a clock to school and being arrested for it, right? And we can think about how race and identity are tied to being creativity. And so this idea of who gets to be creative, right, is tied to this cost. And I'll just add to this because I'm curious what other people think. I'm thinking about Milton's question, right? How can we change the system? And what I'm hoping for us to think about is who is the we in changing that system, right? I think we get to be experts and the sages on the stage for a little while, right? But hopefully we'll be in a conversation with all of you. But that we should be, if we're thinking about how do we actually change that system, we only know a certain amount, right? There should be something that happens synergistically when we're in conversation with young people, when we think about how we amplify the voices of historically marginalized populations that are in the teaching community. I think the EduColor community is a large part of this. I think there's a lot of different ways for us to think through how do we change who the we is and whose voices are centered in that we.
See, when you say that, you also ignore the fact that the system is created so that those who really need to have a voice in that change still don't have a voice.
Yeah.
You know, I joined a school district on an executive leadership team, and hope my school district is not watching this right now. Executive leadership team, and you know, I was hired under the premise of we're going to work together to bring about some different ways of thinking. But in essence, what happens is the system is there and the thinking is there. But yes, you think differently, but here's your space where you can think differently.
Yeah.
And that happens so often. So as much as we all kind of have that desire, there is a reality that sometimes you can have all the desire in the world, but when the community values the judgment or level of score that your school district is going to be compared to others,
Yep.
then you lose a lot of that seat or conversation to create that change. You talk like right now in Texas, we're about to go to an A through F system versus the system we are now. So a lot more of our school districts will be rated underperforming, even though they are actually performing. So in our meetings, the talk is about what do we need to do to meet the grades that the state has placed. It's not on what do our students need and who do they need to be. Honestly, I would love to just turn on a switch and say we're going to just change the system right away and we're not going to care, but that is not reality.
Speaking of Texas, Houston, where we've got a very diverse population, and one of the things that you know, we were preparing for this panel, this equity thing came up because it's one of my pet peeves. Because, and I've seen this for years, for over a decade, and all the work I've done, I've literally had people tell me, well, the project-based learning, problem-based learning, that's great, that's wonderful, it's fun, but it's all fluff, and we don't have time to do that with these kids right now because they're not passing the state test. And that's a quote, that's a literal quote from someone. And sitting in my office and telling me we're about to shut down everything that you're working on. And then I've seen so many other examples of really innovative, cool things happening on campuses where the kids are already doing well, and campuses where kids are struggling, they cut electives and double the kids up in math and double them up in reading so they can pass a test. And my argument has always been, those are exactly the kids who need space and opportunity to be curious and creative and do messy learning work.
Oh, we give it to them, but after school.
After school,
After
right?
school
After
or
school.
before school.
After school,
That's
exactly.
it.
Yes, yes.
Like you have Genius Hour. Right? In this section of the day, you get to be curious.
If you can stay after school.
If you.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit of follow that piece to actions that you've seen effective in carving out that space, right? So I think to Franz's point, yes, we can do certain things within a school, but there are all sorts of levels above and below and on the side of. So what are some pieces and practices that you've seen kind of, oh, look, they were able to make that happen despite?
You know, I've been at this a long time, and there's a lot of retrograde thinking, let's put it that way, in education, has been for a long time. I was at a conference where someone said, why is it that we teach biology first, and then chemistry, maybe in the sophomore year, and then physics in the third or fourth year, this thinking that somehow physics is the most advanced of the sciences, Anyone who's followed science knows that biology and genomics and biotechnology has advanced far beyond. And she referred to a group called the Committee of 10 more than 100 years ago, and they couldn't agree. A group of 10 men meeting at Harvard. Please Google this. I need to know if it's true or not. It sounds like a good story. They're sitting around. They couldn't agree. They couldn't agree what should be the first science course, the sequence of science. They said, forget it. Let's just do it in alphabetical order. Is this true? And here we are. Scientists, physicists will certainly tell you students should be taught physics first. Look at Leon Letterman and the Illinois Math and Science Academy, Nobel laureate. He said physics, the laws of physics have not changed very much in the past 100 years. The laws of biology have just completely changed. So I will say that one bright point, because I think the tendency is to say, oh my gosh, we're just crumbling and continuing this kind of thinking, is that the world has changed dramatically in the past decade. While we've been talking about PBO for 20, 30 years, oh my gosh, at the Lucas Foundation, we can show you films 25 years ago. Great project-based learning. The world is changing much more quickly. Technology is forcing this change. And therefore, you have companies now saying, wait a second, if we're going to continue to survive, we need a different set of skills. We need some coding from people. Maybe you're not going to be a coder, but you need to understand how this works so you can manage teams that are doing this. We need the arts and people who can communicate. So the companies are stepping up saying, we want to survive, and we need a different sort of person than even you, the colleges, are providing. So I would say that hopefully let's have the companies and corporate executives stand up more and say, we need a different kind of student.
So I've also seen some pieces around the adults in the building. And so it's rare that I walk into a school or a district and I have any sense of what the adults in that space are curious about. So how do we do that? How do we encourage the curiosity? Because it's not just children who need to be curious. Right? How do we make that work in an equal way? Because I would say that, to your point, there's a cost to curiosity, but also that, and to kind of the systemic pressures, that in schools that have a lower socioeconomic status, those are teachers that are, you got to do this, you got to do this. How do we make that room for curiosity for the adults as well?
Tell them all to learn something. I think as a great professional development activity is every teacher, every adult in the building should view themselves both as a teacher and as a learner. We're going to change the role definitions. Everyone in this day and age should be able to learn something new and maybe learn from each other. I've done this activity where, not enough time to do it here, but everyone says what they could teach somebody in this room. Surely you know something, and you could teach us something. And what would you like to learn? And you will quickly find there are people in this very room that could teach you what you want to learn. And the internet is your friend. The internet may not be entirely free for a while. We'll see about net neutrality, but there's so much available online to learn things quickly. That's also my bet, that you can learn things more quickly now than we used to.
So I'll come back to, I'm going to cut off my own question. The power. I want to talk a little bit about this. In an era of bingeability, where we can stream everything, is that affecting, in a negative way, our sense of curiosity and following it? Right? So I'm thinking about, like, when I got done with the second episode of Stranger Things, there was not a time where I was like, what's going to happen in episode 3? It was, now I'm watching episode 3. So there was no internal space for curiosity. Is that a piece that we're finding? And Antero, I want to think about your work with games and play, too, and what you're finding.
I mean, I think it sounds like what you're speaking to is the need for reflection, right? And that we don't have that. I think there's, again, I don't know if this is lore, right? And it definitely wasn't a group of 10 men, but there is a study of people's Netflix queues, right? And we always have all of these foreign films and documentaries that we want to watch, but then there's a reason my wife and I watched all of Gilmore Girls, right? Like it's easy, and it's the whitest show ever, right? It's just easy to just kind of reflect on where we are today. Longer conversation. Yeah. Right, but I do think there's something about the fact that I think the last time I watched Netflix, it allows me to skip the opening credits for a show, right? So, you don't have time for that. Just get to the stuff, right? And so in doing that, what do we lose in terms of that process of growth, right? If we think about this from a Freirean sense, from the sense of critical pedagogy, right? That typically this idea of praxis is usually talked about amongst educators as theory and practice being combined. But what Frede has been very deliberate about in his description of praxis is theory, practice, and reflection as these key kind of three parts that are tied to how we grow as human beings and collectively as a society. And so if we don't have a space for reflection, which I think coming back to the first question that you cut yourself off from, we don't allow teachers to have that space for reflection either, right? That is a cost of curiosity for teachers, right? When teachers start asking questions for administrators, oftentimes those are teachers, in my experience, who have to meet with their union rep in our school district, right? So I think when we think through like, how does curiosity have consequences amongst teachers as well? I think I would think about this almost from a hierarchy of needs and think about where do teachers feel safe? And if we create the spaces for safety, we can create spaces for curiosity, which will lead towards spaces of innovation.
So how do we get to, because I would imagine that, Milton, when you said, be curious and learn something, people, I would if I just had time in the day, right? I mean, so how do we move from, here are all the reasons why this can't happen, to, I'm going to take the time to do those things?
We actually did that. My first year in Lufkin, where I am now, that was one of the first things that we did, is to create this safe community space for teachers. And it wasn't just for them to give input on policy and what we did in terms of what tools or whatever they had in their classroom. I really wanted to know what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? What have you created yourself? When we even started talking about makerspaces, we never talked about it through the sense of the buzzword of a makerspace. We talked about it through the sense of when you go home at night and you're sitting and not watching TV, what are you doing? And we learned that they were knitting, they were baking, and actually had bakery businesses that I didn't know about. They were going to craft shows, that they were doing all of this really incredibly creative things. And so that's how we started talking about creativity amongst this cohort of 50 teachers. And so those were the teachers that we started to focus on and to spread with. Were we able to stop the standardized reading program? No, but yeah.
It's on the list, it sounds like.
Nope, it's not on the, that one is one of those things that is out of my control. But it's a whole nother conversation. But we were able to see teachers take risk in classrooms, which honestly, having a kid be able to ask questions and just simply research something they care about or create shouldn't be a risk to begin with. But because of this structure of which we've all come into, it is a risk, but it's one that the community has helped us to break down.
Well, and I want to say that a piece that I heard embedded in there is a realization that I am the reason somebody said they can't do something. So I'm going to turn that piece up, right? Somebody somewhere has probably spoken about the four of you as like, well, I can't because, Stephanie's my boss, even though you are completely open to it. And so it sounds like being reflective and saying, well, then I need to explicitly open up what I do control.
So that's the beauty of having, I hate to say this, I know that the power piece of you holding the mic and saying what we talk about, but I love to play the card of, I do get to make this decision. You can do this thing, and you don't have to ask for permission, just do it. And I do that all the time, and so far I have not been fired, but I think that school districts need to have people that are willing to do that, and it's hard. For me, it is stressful because there's a lot of fight on the back end in order to do those things. There's a lot of finagling of financing in order to do those things, but those are things that have to be done. You have to have the space to do it.
And I would back that up, going back to the how do we create or how do we fight against this system that doesn't allow for that space, and examples of what you've seen, and where I've seen it happen, it's when there's a leader in place, a school principal, or doesn't even have to be the school principal, but it's a leader in place who either builds a barrier between the school and the district and says, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to protect you from whatever the mandate is, or someone who says, I know that's what the rule says, or the policy, or the procedure, or the process, but here is what is best for kids, and this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to ask for forgiveness rather than ask for permission. But that puts you at risk. That puts you at risk of getting fired or, you know, reprimanded in some fashion. But when that happens, then you have, you know, I go back to 2003 to 2005-ish. We had this like beautiful little window of time where we did something very similar with the teachers, where we gave them what we call PLP time. And we literally built the time into the weekly schedule and said, you've got these 2 hours every other Friday to learn whatever it is you want to learn for your classroom. And we had a little bit of parameter around that, just saying, you know, like, it's got to be about student learning, but if you want to learn something new, then here's your time to do it. We're not going to dictate to you. We're not going to say, this is the PD you have to attend that day. And you can do it through reading a book. You can work with a colleague to explore a new technique. You can, you know, if I were doing this several years later, I would have said, you can blog, you can do Twitter chats, things like that. So having leaders in place who can build that time in for teachers. But I'll add to that, and I'm going to quote you because several months ago, I don't know when it was, you posted something on Twitter, and I loved it. And it said, if you went home tonight and overnight all your curriculum disappeared, what would you teach tomorrow? And I thought that was a wonderful question, and I thought, okay, like, that's what we need to be asking people every day. If the system that constrains us disappeared, what would school look like tomorrow? What would we go and create tomorrow if we didn't have this system that was created 100 years ago by this committee of 10? Or an assessment system that was created by publishing companies?
Well, I think to both of your points, you're working at a district level and making these decisions. But I'm hearing you speak, and I think, well, a classroom teacher asks that same question of their students, right? I mean, it's who are you responsible for caring for, and how are you doing that in the most humane way possible? Right. I want to make a point that I hope leads to you saying, yes, let's keep talking about that. To the point of young children, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of years of college education up on the stage right now. And the last degree I bet we all got, we got to say a little bit more about what we wanted to learn. But when we were 5 and we started our journey, assuming that we were in kind of standard schools, that was the least amount of choice that we had in our day. How do we flip that? So the kindergarten student, we say, you got to get the letters and the names and everything down. And then if you can get to like 25 years old, then you'll start to really take control of your learning again. How do we switch? And maybe that's.
So I'm going to say that's where personalization comes in, but real personalization, not the bad version of the word. So in other words, sitting down with kids and saying, what do you want to learn today? And how do you want to learn it? If you don't know, then how can I help guide you to help you figure out how to learn that? That is hard to do in a system where we have state standards and we have to pass a test. But you can still incorporate some of that within that system until we find a way to blow up the system and start it over from scratch and have more freedom. But that's my answer to that one.
How are we defining learning? That's my question with that. Because when you ask that question, I think of the 5-year-old. I do think of the kids who learn through play. They learn all kinds of, you know, tangible skills all the time that we don't value or acknowledge. So maybe we should flip the question and say, what did you learn yesterday outside of this classroom, or what did you learn at a time that wasn't a part of our lesson? Or what else do you want to know about that? And maybe let that be a springboard or guide. But my gosh, how many of our schools have taken play away from kindergartners and replaced it with a district assessment? And I know that we don't want to go test, but honestly, that is a critical issue with why the lack of creativity and curiosity.
I'd love to see more experiments, starting with 5-year-olds. Again, I think we're living.
It's a strange sentence.
Experiments on 5-year-olds?
Especially to tell them that this is no longer a time in which we as adults are going to tell you what you need to know. I think if we really admitted it to ourselves, we don't really know what they should know 15, 20 years from now when they're graduating, when they're getting ready to work in the workforce. I do think we're living in a time where students could take much more control over their own learning, where parents especially, starting in the preschool years, even earlier, parent education, please, look, can we get to that? Parents should understand this, that they are their child's first and most important teacher. They do more during those first 5 years before we even see them on the kindergarten door to help set the frame for this. But there are, for instance, platforms now where a kid can keep track of every book they've ever read, every piece of art they've ever seen, every experience. They can keep a portfolio of their own learning starting at a very early age. You tend to see this again starting in high schools, maybe middle schools, this idea of portfolios and creating a body of your work. But you could start that much younger. So I'd love to see that. I'd love to see students being told, you are now the master of your own learning. You are now an entrepreneur of your own learning. This is your life project. You're 5 years old. And the first hurdle is, by the time you're 8, you need to be reading at the 4th grade level. So here's what you need to know as a 5-year-old, and every year, you cannot wait, but every week, every month, you need to be making progress. If we could get all kids to 4th grade reading level, that would be a huge thing, believe me. So I think we're at a time we can do that. We just haven't seen many people saying, yeah, let's try to do this with our youngest kids, rather than constantly trying to remediate adolescent literacy. We have teenagers who cannot read as well as a 5-year-old. How did that happen?
But what do you do on the equity piece of that? Because you mentioned about parents needing to know that you're responsible for this kid, these first few years of life, and everything you do is important, and that is important. But I will tell you, as a mother who went to school at night and didn't see my kids during those times of the years, it's not always that simple. And I did have family to kind of help to interject with that.
Sure.
But I think we can't, you're creating a barrier by saying that. And yes, there's a parent education piece, but there's a massive equity piece there in terms of access to that. The kids that you talk about that learn in that way, we can probably name some schools around our schools that are not a part of our public systems where they absolutely do that. And I think that goes back to my initial curiosity question that you asked earlier. How do we take that and bring it to kids who don't have that and who don't have, it's the parent piece that's right there from 2 years old, reading and playing games and taking them to experiences, because that's just not reality for a large majority of kids.
I like the extended family model. I like any adult who comes in contact with a kid to understand this, to try to bring along these experiences. And, of course, camps and things cost money, coming to science centers costs money. But I think creative parents, I just point to Jim Comer's parents. James Comer, please, can we pay some homage to Jim Comer? Take a look at his book about his parents. They came to Gary, Indiana. They had not gotten through high school, came from the South. All 5 of their kids went on to graduate school, including little Jim Comer, became one of our most distinguished child psychiatrists. So his mother understood, his mother Maggie understood. Just by taking a bus ride, there's a lot you can do in conversation with your kids when you're in the car, when you're at home. Granted, some limited time with your kids. But there are things that you can do to, put that curiosity bug in there.
Well, I think maybe what I'm not hearing is the conversation about kind of municipalities being a part of this conversation,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So it's not you go to school and then you go home and the people who are in those buildings are the ones who matter. But having these conversations, and to Antero's point about citizenship, right? Thinking through who our civic leaders are, and how do we pull that in? How do we have that conversation? I think Helen Jim is here, who has worked very hard for the students of Philadelphia around that piece, and saying that is an important piece as well, right? So that it isn't
It's community.
these two sites, right?
Right.
I think we should be thinking about what's the narrative of what school is supposed to be and what is supposed to happen in classrooms. And this is one of the things I don't necessarily know how to fix. I know how to fix everything else.
Another conversation.
And that is, I've taught in several teacher ed programs at this point, and most of the teachers who are coming in, who are becoming teachers today, are in their early 20s. Their entire K through 12 schooling experience was through No Child Left Behind. which means their understanding of what happens in schools is grounded by specific forms of assessment, right? And even if we're in this post No Child Left Behind, we're still in it's the same thing, right? And so when you think about the narratives of what students and what parents think schools look like, right, continues to be reinforced every year. And so when I work with teachers and I try to, if we can just kind of keep moving it back, when do we instill creativity and curiosity into teacher education programs? Oftentimes the resistance I get is from future teachers who want to know, tell me what to do in the classroom tomorrow, right? How do I do X thing? As if it is a manual and as if it's, steering a ship when we're talking about we're talking about individuals in their lives, right? And so I think this is where we need to think through whether curiosity can be sustained in teacher ed programs, in schools, and how we can shift a narrative about what we imagine the space that we call school to look like, right? Because I think it's easy for us to be lofty about that, but my experience is even in trying to carve out similar spaces for teachers is I was able to carve out, a dedicated PD time every month for a year with a group of teachers to engage in what we call player professional development, right? So that teachers were going to play games. This is the only time we thought about having PD that was fun, that any of us could remember in our teaching experience. And they worked for 2 months, and then the principal who was on board with all of this realized that we have an accreditation for the school, and all of that time was taken up, as it typically is, right? And so we can think through the constraints between the system, the narratives that exist, and the wants and desires of parents, of community, of students, and of teachers in all of these pieces. So one thing I can. Thanks.
Give you a little bit more time, maybe by the end of the
Yeah,
conversation.
give me a second.
You can get that taken care of. Yeah. So I want to ask a question, Milton. You mentioned that when you were doing those surveys, as you were kind of thinking through 3-2-1 contact, you meant what were the age range?
8 to 12-year-olds.
8 to 12-year-olds. Was there a difference in the curiosity of an 8-year-old versus a 12-year-old? Like, I'm just thinking number of questions.
I don't think we measured that specifically, but certainly as you go through the grade levels, if you look at creativity, the arts, yeah, you begin to see a decline in that. I think Ken Robinson likes to ask a question of kindergarten students, how many of you are artists? And they all raise their hand. And by 5th grade, maybe half of them or a third, but by 8th grade, none of them really think of themselves as artists. So I do believe that the kids are born creative. It needs to be nurtured, but we're not doing enough, certainly, to bring that forward.
Well, and then to that point, once we get to middle school and high school, where we've really just shut down that creativity, that curiosity, how do you reactivate it? I mean, I've been in rooms of adults, and we get through something that looked like it was really interesting and exciting, and the next question I ask is, what questions do you have? And there is silence. So what are some ways, this isn't just for Milton, that would be a horrible thing to do to you.
No.
But how do we reactivate the curiosity?
I will just speak for myself. I am exhibit A of this. I was telling the group earlier, I am the son of a piano teacher. When I was a boy, I sat at the piano and learned very abstractly. Okay, my mother told me, this is a piano. You're 5 years old. There's 88 keys. Here's the white keys. Here's the black keys. An octave is 8 notes. Hold your hands like this, so your palms are big enough to just put a little ping pong ball in it. Just very. And this is the way by the way, you can make the analogy to mathematics. You can make the analogy to reading. We teach kids these little tiny, little isolated things and take the joy out of learning. So fast forward 60 years, I'm taking up jazz piano. I'm old enough to be the father of my teacher. He's in his 30s. And the role of technology, the role of digital, so many apps, so many ways. We're constantly taking videos of him performing something. He'll send me the file. You can download Miles Davis playing Blues by 5, and you can slow it down. There's an app where you can slow it down, and you can play that just as Miles Davis is improvising. How do people learn to play the piano before the internet? I don't know. They are geniuses because it's a great time for learning whatever it is you want to learn. We're talking today about use of Rosetta Stone for learning foreign language. Oh my gosh, the apps for learning foreign language today. If you've ever harbored in the back of your mind, I want to learn some Italian, now's your time.
so I have 2 points on that, on your question on that. Because, well, first of all, one of the things I had to learn in all of in my career, in my work, is that I had to learn that not everybody thought like I did, and found it as easy as I did to think about school differently, because I started my career in the art classroom. And it took a little while for me to understand that, why aren't they understanding what I'm saying to them about what learning can look like in the classroom? You know, why is that math team looking at me like I'm speaking a foreign language? Because my experience, and I came into education through an alternative program, so I had 2 degrees in art, not art education, just in art and design, before I went into K-12 education. So I had many years of being in an art classroom where there's a lot more freedom, curiosity, creativity, and now I've completely forgotten the second point that I was going to make. But oh no, I know what it is now. So I had to learn that first. I had to learn that to reach educators, I had to realize that our experiences are very different. And exactly what you're talking about, we teach the way we know that we experienced school, and whether it's these young teachers coming in who have experienced nothing but No Child Left Behind model of school, or veteran teachers who are experienced with that because they've taught in that environment, but also went through a very traditional model. It's hard to think of something different because you didn't see that model. So on that piece, from a leadership standpoint, then we've got to change how we interact with teachers. And meetings and PD all have to look like we model it. We model what we want to see in the classroom. The other point that I wanted to make on that is that when we were designing A+ Up, the middle school in the Houston Museum District that I helped launch, that's mobile, or at least the pilot was highly mobile, personalized. We started that school design with a question: can we design a school that doesn't have walls, doesn't have books, doesn't have one specific place, and the learning is very organic and very personalized? And we were going to start with 6th graders. But as we were designing it, we knew there was going to be an on-ramp period where we called the teachers learning coaches, where the learning coaches and the students who were coming in from the traditional system would have to get used to this model, which looks and feels completely different from what they're used to. And what we found out is that that on-ramp period was much longer than we expected. And I no longer work with the school, but a few weeks ago I had a talk with my former boss about it, and he said as they have continued to try to grow the school and continue the model, they're finding that traditional mindset, that traditional school model mindset, is incredibly hard to break. So they're having varying degrees of success with getting kids and teachers and parents out of that mindset of what that looks like.
But I think what you said there at the beginning, to your first point, there was a piece of you realizing I have to be curious about why these people are, like, there's a need for your own curiosity, right?
Right.
So not, I'm going to yell at them until they let me do more creative things.
Right.
But how did you get there? Let me ask some of those. I have to be genuinely curious as to how people arrived at those.
Which is reflection, right? Like, that's taking time out of the work to be reflective enough to figure out why something isn't.
In fact, you're saying that's what is missing oftentimes when you do a PD or you do some kind of activity and you just get the cricket sound from teachers, right? Although I don't think there's ever actually the cricket sound. I would love that.
No, that'd be amazing.
It'd be so great.
Yeah.
There's an app for that, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
play that for
yeah.
if you like.
All right. Nobody download it right now, please.
Cricket app.
I will say, I mean, so before we came out, we were talking in the back room, and I learned about grits. It was a very useful conversation.
Southern grits.
Southern grits. So, oh yeah, that's right. We're talking about the word we won't bring up, and this led to asking about grits.
It did.
Forgot the trajectory of how it happened. And you said that grits is typically sugar and butter only are what you put on grits,
Southern grits.
except with
Southern grits.
except with shrimp, right?
Yeah, you don't put sugar and butter with shrimp and grits.
Yes. It doesn't sound bad. But I hear,
There's a whole point to this.
there's a point, yeah. Sorry, the point is I'm hungry. The way I'm imagining a point is when we talk about creativity, whether it be in an art classroom or playing jazz piano or making grits, what we imagine as creative is being constrained by starting with a fixed object of what something is supposed to be, and then knowing how to play around it so it's still recognizable as that, right? So it's no longer jazz piano if I pull out an accordion and instead I'm playing a Weird Al song, right? That's not jazz piano, it's something different entirely, right? And it's no longer art class if instead I'm turning in algorithms and I'm not Cy Twombly or something, right? And it's no longer grits if I didn't pull out grits to cook, right? And it's actually cream of wheat, which is what was distinguished to get us into that conversation. Turns out those are two very different things. And so what I'm thinking about, sorry, I really had a point.
This is amazing.
I wonder if we're asking the wrong questions at the end of that interactive PD, and you say, are there any questions? And you get the cricket sound metaphorical, because it doesn't.
Because it's not real.
Doesn't happen. There's an app for it. Instead, maybe we ask questions like, how might we, right? And it allows people to improvise around things they already know and engage in repertoires that they're already familiar with, as if it is a jazz solo on a piano. There's a book on improvisation called Improv by Keith Johnstone. And he talks about a couple of activities that I found really useful in classrooms when I was working with students. And one game, it's similar to Augusto Bilal's work, but it doesn't have the equity lens. I would encourage you to read across both of these texts. But one of his games is just called Let's. And the idea is you and a group of participants stand in a group. It's probably a typical improv activity.
I'm with you.
And you just say, let's, and then you say the thing. Let's dance, and everyone dances. Or let's yell, and everyone yells, right? And it probably doesn't sound like a very fun game, because you just do the thing, right? But then you just think about how can you unlock different kinds of things that could be engaged through a simple activity like let's, right? And so if we think about that Q&A moment at the end of a PD, or in a classroom, or in whatever kinds of settings we're thinking about, how do we shift to a let's or a how might we as a way to create opportunities for curiosity that teachers might not feel they were willing to ask or didn't know they had the capability of asking in those spaces because we've become too rigid in our understanding.
I'm glad you mentioned improv, because there's something that seems quite esoteric, but it is being taught by companies. I'm living in the Bay Area. Tech companies are having their new employees engage in improv. Carnegie Mellon is having their new freshmen engage in improv, because what it does is teaches you to collaborate. Imagine if the five of us had to create something, work on a project that, of course, would be bigger than any of us working on our own, which is the model school, doing your own work. But again, in the workplace, 5 people have to create a new vehicle, have to create a new marketing campaign. How do we work together? Improv puts you on equal footing. And one of the techniques of improv is when someone says something, you can't say, Stephanie, that's a horrible idea. You have to say, Stephanie, that's a great idea. I'm going to add something to it. That's called plussing in improv. You plus up your partners and build something much bigger.
And that
So
bigger thing,
skills,
we need
yeah.
it to be in a certain color. What color is that? That's it's an improv.
Yeah.
Activity.
I'm just wondering, what exactly is the PD? Because PD, when you talk about PD in school, when you mention it, I don't know one single teacher that jumps up and down and like, yes. I even recall one in this room who was Instagram storying his PD. It was all about how to turn on an iPad. So like, I think the learning itself, I didn't even have to say who it was.
No.
The learning itself, I think has to be valuable and valid to the person doing the learning for them to even want to add to it. Because if you sit me in a room and force me, and it happens, to sit and learn how to turn on an iPad, and you ask me yes and, well, I might argue with you about having to come to that session.
Yeah.
But I think that also creates the disconnection from the learning itself, makes people maybe not want to, maybe they don't really care about it. I think you need to care. And I don't know how we talk about PD without talking about how do we have more learning experiences that we as teachers care about and see the value in for our kids.
Well, and I would say let's take it back to the things that are done to us as teachers, as administrators, wherever we are, right? And so hopefully others have had the experience of kind of being in that professional development room and the principal coming in and saying, I know we all know this, but I've got to do it. Right? Don't blame me. Somebody sent me a memo. Right? And then so know that this hurts me as much as it hurts you, and then we all suffer through it. Versus the idea of saying, hey, you know what? Next Thursday, we're going to have to sit down and talk about, CPR. Right? So, but before we do that, so I'm not just doing what is in the can that has been sent, what are some things you're curious about around CPR, right? So asking that question before we get into the room and saying, here's the 3 things I actually have to say, and then we use the rest of the time for that. So we're checking the box of what's required,
Right.
but we're not saying we have no agency in how this box is opened. I just mixed my metaphor on boxes and how you check them and open them.
We follow that.
But you could do that. If you wrote on a box and then you opened it, it's possible. This is one of the pieces from Twitter, and I haven't been calling people's names, but know that I am actively watching this Twitter feed. And it's a piece that has occurred to me as well. We have been using the word curiosity and creativity, and I think we have been using them interchangeably. So does the murmuring audience. Is there a difference?
Yes.
What's the difference if there is one? And if not, why not? You have 350 words, go.
One is much safer for felines. Just stop there.
I warned you about those jokes before we came out here. Creativity didn't do anything to the cat.
That's right.
Look at all the things he's painted. Sorry. But curiosity and creativity, separate? How, why?
I think they're separate. I can wonder about something without actually making it or without putting it into action. Maybe the wondering actually leads to the making. And I think maybe that's the part is missing per se, is we don't offer enough time to wonder. And how do you get to even talking about making? And like when we make, we define what that making is. Like we give kids recipes. We're very good at that. I'm sure Sir Ken Robinson referenced to that instance. But we are honestly sometimes terrible about starting with the wondering part itself and allowing those different pathways to grow. I did a project in my school district this semester with grades 3 through 5, and I started out, we were teaching them how to make and code with microcontrollers. And my old staff looked at me like I was crazy because, number one, we didn't start out with let's teach all the facilitators how to do it. It was, let's get the pieces that we know we need to do and start with maybe some basic lessons, and we're going to learn and do this along the way. And oh, by the way, we're not going to tell the kids what exactly they're going to make. We're going to let them decide what that is. And we're not going to tell them what materials to use. We're going to let them tell us what materials that they need. And then we paused because 4th and 5th grade kind of handled it quite well. They were excited. This was completely different from anything they'd ever done in school. And 3rd grade was a beatdown because they hadn't had those experiences. And I even found myself wanting to, maybe we should give them constraints because this is scary. But I think the best decision that we ever made was to not do that. We stuck it, the adults were adults, and we stuck it through and let the kids be kids. So we let them learn, we let them go beyond what we were teaching, and we let them wonder, and we let them come up with whatever their end product was, and a lot of it went well beyond what we showed them how to do. So yes, those are 2 different things to answer your very first question.
I wanted limitations, or is there more on creativity? And no, you have the best answer.
What she said.
All right, yeah.
Nice job.
We'll ditto that. One of the pieces I want to think about is the role of limitation in creativity. So thinking about the story, the boy who harnessed the wind. A few years ago on this panel, we were talking about innovation, and it was put forward that the idea is that innovation is much easier when you have more constraints about. Is there something said about creativity? Are we more creative where we have fewer resources? Or not creativity, curiosity. I did it. You're right. I heard it. But are we more likely to be curious about things? And I guess this is the antithesis of the point that you started us with. Am I more likely to be curious when there's less to work with?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Well, I go back to the very first question you threw at us. What are we curious about right now? And for me, the things that I'm curious about right now are things that have a whole lot of constraints around them. So for me right now personally, there's a lot of curiosity emerging from some constraints that seem almost, just impossible to overcome. But I think there's answers out there, so I'm curious about that.
I don't know. I'm thinking about that. I think about the person who, so I'm a Minecrafter too. So I think about how I've learned how to, I'm building a Beyonce world, and I had to learn how to do some crazy things with redstone.
Say more.
You just wait. I'm gonna YouTube live it when it's ready. It is fun. It's actually transforming into half Beyonce, half BTS, the Korean pop band.
Sure.
I love them. So. So anyway,
it's like every other panel you've ever been to, right?
It is. So it is. I started with a YouTube video because I was curious how to, I wanted to know how to make a trapdoor open. And then when I watched that video, there was something else in that video that I didn't know how to do. So then I had to go to another video to learn how to do that. And I found myself in the same cycle that I kind of, haphazardly kind of yelled at my nephew for, spending hours going video to video in order to go create this thing. So I don't know if it's about a limitation of resources. I think you have to have resources, period. You can be, I think that's kind of essential per se, depending on what it is you're curious about. You can be curious about something small, like where's that ant going that is walking across my floor, and I'm gonna follow that ant until I find it. Oh wow, there's a hole. What happens in the hole? Let's dig through the hole in the floor. Not that this has ever happened in my life, but I mean, I think that it kind of depends on where your starting point was, and then where that takes you. But those resources can be digital or physical. A spoon to dig into the kind of soft part of the floor versus a
really detailed description for something that hasn't actually happened.
It may or may not have happened,
Okay.
and I may or may not have gotten grounded for that.
I mean, I think that speaks to like this idea of do more constraints allow you to be more curious. It sounds like thinking about these as examples, you get to be curious around things that have constraints if you have the possibility to follow them through, right? If you have the resources to explore them, right? So if I'm a kid in school and I'm curious about why so many students are suspended for various reasons, right? I might be in a classroom context where my teacher would support me in exploring and trying to understand how those issues are enacted, how school policies could or couldn't be changed, right? Or I could be in a space where even asking those questions, and based on the way I might have asked questions in my past, leads to consequences which stifle that kind of curiosity down the road.
That's a
right?
really good example.
And so I think about how, again, like the lens of equity will speak to what does curiosity and what do constraints mean, and who gets the resources around those kinds of questions.
And I like the model of students who are curious across a broad range of things. Again, in education, we tend to carve up things by subject area, and that leads to these disciplines. It leads to students saying, well, I'm a science person, I'm not an art person. Or I'm a art person, but I'm not a math person. I like the idea of if you're going to be curious, you should be curious about a broad range of things, because you will then be seeing how the arts and the sciences come together.
Or Beyonce and BTS.
Yeah, the
They
Korean,
go together,
Korean
I
pop band.
promise.
There you
We'll
go.
talk about it later.
So
The
maybe
after party is going to be amazing.
and then I like kids who are creative on a very deeply creative. So that's the model of sometimes called the T student. Students who are just interested across the top of the T in everything. If they're interested in science, say, there's a cool art exhibit on the weekend. You want to go? They don't say, no, I'm a science, I don't do art. They say, yeah, I'd like to go. I'm curious about that. I could see, maybe I'll learn something. But then the main part of the T, kids who are very creative and deeply creative, whatever it is, whether it's science, math, art, that's the notion of the T student.
I want to follow that a little bit and think about some narratives that we have and some kind of pieces that we see in sets of data, and think about a student's sex or gender, and kind of the narratives that are developed around, if you are a boy kind of kid, you are going to be interested, like science and math are open to you, and if you are a girl kind of kid, then you then good. Oh, you're reading. That's what you do. Right? That's the narrative that's there. How do we use curiosity, or do we reframe curiosity? Like, are we giving a passive or tacit permission for different kinds of kids to be curious in different spaces? And what do we need to be aware of there?
I think you are, because the curiosity comes from experiences. Sometimes you have no idea what to question if you've never been in that environment. And we do that from, honestly, when they're 5 and we walk in and all the girls' side are pink drawers and the boys are all red or blue drawers, or before 5 when we're at home having gender reveal parties and we dress little boys up in sports and little girls up in bows and tiaras. And I think that definitely plays a role. My parents would not let me play sports because they thought that girls shouldn't play sports.
Mm-hmm.
Insane, but that was their belief. My brother got to play sports and he got to explore different elements of himself that we didn't get to do. It's odd that we still see some of that even now. We have parents that won't let their kids do coding and robotics like girls because they don't feel like girls should be doing that. And that is one of the biggest fights of many fights, but one of them that we have had to have that I honestly didn't think that was a thing until I saw that it was.
Other thoughts?
I think it's very destructive, and as you're saying, points to the role of parents both for good and for ill. A lot of stereotypical thinking amongst those of us adults who are responsible for children. I think it's very destructive. I'm glad to see some movement towards bringing more girls into the STEM fields, bringing more boys into the artistic fields. But again, we've got a long ways to go.
So, as an educator, I've always, our team always tried very hard to encourage more girls to take the engineering classes and to take an interest in those things. But when you ask this question, I go to something very personal, and I have 10-year-old twins, a girl and boy. And when they were born, we were very conscious about not just giving him boy toys and just giving her girl toys. Now they gravitated toward that on their own. As soon as he saw a ball, he picked it up and he just immediately threw it without anybody showing him how to do that. And it was just his nature to do that. But what happened as they continued to grow and develop is my daughter Dylan was just like a voracious reader. She was just like read everything, and he was really good with Austin. My son was really good with puzzles, and that turned into being really good in math. And we've been struggling at home to because they're twins. This is why it's in my head, because they're twins and they see each other all the time, and he sees that she's good in reading, and he doesn't feel like he's good in reading, because he doesn't feel like he's as good as she is in reading. And she got in her head that she wasn't as good in math as he was. So it's been a personal challenge at home to fight that and to find ways for her to feel successful with things that are math or puzzles or Scratch is great because they all loved that, and then so she was doing coding and things like that. And then I had to sit down with my son and talk to him about really try to sit down with him in a bookstore and try to find things that he would want to read to help him build that confidence. And so it's hard. It seemed easy before I had kids and I was just working on a campus, right? And oh well, we got more girls to sign up for the engineering class, yay! But dealing with it on a personal level at home, it makes it so much more real.
I think about two different responsibilities that educators have around this, and one is the increasing the opportunities for all participants in our classroom, right, including gender non-conforming students in our schools and teachers in our schools. And so I think on the one hand, it's about increasing those kinds of opportunities for everybody. and also recognizing that women have a much more difficult time beyond school settings, right? So just encouraging girls to code, right, doesn't mean that the STEM workforce is any more welcoming to women currently in its current stance. Adding to that, right, we can think about how the narratives of Gamergate, right, as particularly affecting the women and the queer community, and how that shapes the narratives around gaming and youth culture and the places that we typically assume that people are found to be creative and curious as two different things. How do we shift those narratives? And then, sorry, if you think about, so Zoe Quinn, one of the people who was at the heart of the Gamergate movement, had a memoir come out last year and really does a nice job. The second half of that book is all on advocacy and what we can do as a result of some of the fallout from that. And one of the things that and several other narratives have made clear is how the same people who were violent and oppressive in these online spaces are close to the similar kinds of alt-right white supremacist actions that have been happening in online spaces and are clearly tied to issues that continue to follow us underneath President Trump. Right? And so if we follow these through, right, these conversations around feminist epistemologies of how we understand the arts in classrooms, right, to choose one thread that we need to pull out in classrooms, is tied to, what does it mean to be a participant in civic society, right, and to increase not only tolerance, but dialogue amongst one another, right? I just want to make sure that we're understanding how these pieces are tied together and how my actions of encouraging sports for some of my students and not for other students, the gender reveals, all of these pieces are inherently tied to issues that are affecting us right now at a policy level all the way down.
You're asking teachers too to embody those that's the same type of mindset, and that is an additional, that's an entirely different layer right now.
And an easy one.
It is right now. I just came from a tech conference right before coming here, and I thought I was going to die. I walked into the vendor areas, the worst. But as I sat there as an observer, you watch people gravitate toward, oh, I want to go buy this little robot, and this is going to be my STEM answer, and this is going to be my creativity answer. Like, we've defined what that is, but there are broader issues with this that we ignore entirely. We create a space in school that is different from the real world. So that probably gets back to the initial question of where all of this started, is how do we bring that world into school? And maybe that's where that curiosity comes from. But we have to be a part of that learning too. And
we should just name that 9 out of 10 times those vendors are white men who've created those products, right? Well, you should think about like the dispositions and identities of who's created the tools that we assume are going to create better learners in classrooms.
So everything's horrible.
Yeah, it's great. Good talk.
Yeah. What's the good, right? Like in the research that you've been doing, Antero, in the piece, like when you're visiting classrooms, when you're seeing these spaces, what are the best things that you're seeing around the issue of curiosities, the best practices? And I don't mean that in the kind of overused sense, but the things that you like, all right, we're going to be okay. If this person's doing this, then we might have a shot at that as they're going through as well.
I think the good, and I'll be brief though, I think the good and the great stuff that I see come from young people and their ingenuity to use the word ingenuity to think about ingenuity as a human right. There's a big push towards this as a conversation. And so if we look at, I spent a lot of time reading and studying young adult literature, which just means I get to read a bunch of kids' books, and it's awesome. And so typically, young books, like all of the movies that are being made, The Maze Runner and Divergent, all these books are about young kids overthrowing the government and saving everybody, right? And it's about kids, and those are awesome narratives, right? And typically they only happen in science fiction and fantasy books like young adult novels, right? But we can also look at how young people are at the heart of things like Black Lives Matter, right? And they are being ingenious in the ways that they are creating new forms of civic protest and activism, right? And these are things that aren't coming from a top-down model of what action looks like, right? But are being created and are pushing beyond what most of us thought were possible or what we imagined civic imagination could look like. And so I think that's where I find a lot of hope, is understanding what young people are already doing and seeing how we as adults can catch up to where they're going.
And I'd say that what I see as a sign of hope is that when I go into classrooms or when I work with educators, and I'll just keep it within Houston as a good example, is that over the past several years, I'm seeing more and more people thinking outside of the box, asking more questions, asking more why questions. Like, why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this? How might we? How can we do something different? And the numbers are growing. So I see, even though the power structures are still in place in Texas, and it's very much against real deeper learning, innovation, building in more curiosity, opportunities for curiosity and creativity. The numbers of people that are willing to say, I'm going to do this anyway, that's growing.
I like this whole movement, and we saw some of it today in the movement at SLA, to really open up the connection between schools and the workplace. That this is not just about vocational education as it was when I was in school. This is about exposing kids to the real world of work, and then through that igniting their passions. They can see how something they're learning in math, something they're learning in science might be applied in a hospital setting, might be applied in an architect's office. We saw students making films. A great example of technology now on your laptop, on your smartphone. So every student can now be a filmmaker, but they need to experience and learn what that craft is. So connecting up the world of work and the future of careers. In California, we have these linked learning, it's sometimes called, multiple pathways, sort of career technical ed 2.0. But I think that's one of the bright spots. If we could break down this barrier between school and the rest of the world, especially careers, that we don't quite know what the future careers will be for students, I think that's a positive. And kids will begin to see, oh, I should be spending my time while I'm in school learning some things I could actually use.
And really quick, what Antero said, and I'll just stop there because it was literally everything with students and sitting and learning from them and letting that drive what we do. And I think the other thing that I see that is good, and I can say that just coming from, I'm in a school district that is very rural, East Texas. Our town is in the middle of a forest, but we actually have so many community partners that have wanted to come in and help support new programs that were accessible to all of our students, or any students that were absolutely interested. And yes, we have a lot of standardization, but we do have a great, there's a large number of people that are willing to do certain things different in terms of connecting to students to pathways outside of our community or in our community, and our partners that help with that have been really essential to that.
I want to focus for just a second on Stephanie and Rafran's as folks who are working at a kind of the district level, and talking to a room that is largely folks who are working at the school level and in the classroom. What are some things that folks might assume that they can't do around curiosity that you would love to see more of in your spaces, right? Like, you know, oftentimes in my job, I get a lot of things where it's like, oh, you don't need permission for that, but sure, you've got permission for that, if that's what it takes. But what are some spaces where you think, oh man, you could do that? That's cool.
I think there's more than one way to teach a standard. I mean, if there's a standard we all would know we have to teach, the standard, I always look at it as the guideline, and this is sort of the thing that the kids need to know how to do. But the assumption is that you have to go online or to the book and do it in that exact way. And some schools do mandate that. But even when they do, you can kind of not do that sometimes. But you can absolutely look at, I say that and I can feel darts on my head. But I say that knowing that, I mean, I've done it as a teacher, and even as from an administrative standpoint, is the first thing that they say is, well, we have to make sure that we teach this thing. I'm like, but an example is we teach engineering in elementary, and one of the teachers invited me in to be a judge for a back scratching contest where all the kids make back scratchers for engineering. It's the greatest thing, but also here's the part that wasn't. The whole point wasn't making the back scratcher. The whole point was the engineering process. So the question I asked the teacher was, tell me something. What did you want kids to take away from this lesson? And she said, well, we wanted them to think about the engineering processes and design thinking. I said, did they all have to make the same thing in order to do that? And that changed that lesson from there on out. And I think that is an essential, that is something that I hope that all of our teachers start to really learn. We still have some that feel like they can't, but the more we have conversations like this, the more that hopefully they feel like they can.
And I would just piggyback off of that and say, yes, there's more than one way to help a student learn a standard. And I would say, you know, it's perfectly okay. You don't need anyone's permission to sit in a classroom with kids and ask them how they think they might be able to learn that standard. And the back scratcher example in art, we call that making bats. Like everybody's going to make the same bat for the Halloween project. You know, no, we don't have to do that.
It's interesting because that sounded more like advice to your fellow kind of district administrators than anything. Like, go and just give people the space to do what they're wanting to do, not necessarily.
We did that. We read a book called Building School 2.0 that we, written by Chris Lehman and Zach Chase last year as a district book study. And, you know, I talked about it, and I've mentioned, and I've joked and said, you know, we did that book study, but then the book study ended when the book ended. But I have seen some elements of that from our principals to our, so I know that they took that away when they're, from a leadership standpoint, in terms of even how they work with the teachers in our schools, that you do have some freedom outside of the standard reading program. But you do have some freedom to think differently and not have to do this lesson in the way that it was done. But I think that the leadership standpoint, like we do intentional leadership meetings every month, and so every month I'm guaranteed 20 minutes of a lesson with Refrans. And we do crazy things and I make my superintendent does it. But I think if we didn't have that space for us to rethink what learning is to us, then the space wouldn't also be able to be created at the school level with our students to rethink what learning is for them outside of the standardized reading program.
And then, this is, I'm going to, first of all, mildly uncomfortable, which is strange. But I also want, you'd made the point again, without saying it explicitly, of asking, where am I inadvertently standing in the way of curiosity, and how do I change that structure? And I think that I've heard it mentioned in different ways by the panel the entire night, but I think it's a great point going through. I want to focus on the next 2 days, right? So folks are here Saturday and Sunday, some amazing conversations on the program. So my question would be, what are some challenges that you would make to the folks, to all of us, as we're going through those conversations? What's an action to inspire and drive and kind of fill out the wide and the deep curiosity as folks are going through those conversations?
Go to conversations that you are uncomfortable with. That, my first year coming to EduCon was overwhelming, and I was freaked out. And every year thereafter, even when the conversation submission time comes, there's always an internal struggle of, I cannot do this, because it's such an uncomfortable thing to get into a space to talk about something, number one, you don't know. Number two, you feel like you're not that great at, but that's where you can become more curious about how you can grow from it.
And I would say, you know, I don't know where everybody's from and what kind of districts you're coming from, but I know the types of conversations that happen here, and I would say go in and get rid of the yes but, I can't do that on my campus because, and go in and engage in this dialogue with folks here and think, yes, and
How might we?
How might we?
See, I was listening.
And think about possibilities. Keep your mind open to that, and talk about constraints. Be open. As you're dialoguing with people over the next 2 days, talk about the constraints you're facing, because someone else in the room may have had the same constraint or the same obstacle, and they overcame it through some creative
I would add to the be uncomfortable, because I think that's great. Be generous, right? So all of us have something to add to this, and I wouldn't hold back the kinds of knowledge and expertise that all of us bring into these spaces. And then I will selfishly plug, I have a session tomorrow morning with my friend and colleague Nicole Mira, who's driving in from New York right now. She's a professor at Rutgers University, where we're specifically looking at, the work that we're talking about is called Youth Participatory Action Research, and it's specifically about how do we center the voices and questions of young people in empirical research settings that we do at the university level. And so if you are a teacher, if you are a young person, if you are a coach of any kind, you should come to this session, because it'll be better than all the other ones.
And I was gonna go to that.
That's right.
Yeah,
I like how you led with be generous.
Yeah. To an
yourself.
extent. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I like the idea of getting your students involved. You know that I like the idea of opening up PD to students. There are some districts where the students actually come and attend the PD and see what it is the teachers are learning, and that helps them understand the role of teaching. If you're trying to learn something new, whether it's something professionally or, as I suggest, something just outside of your profession, make sure your students catch you doing it. Show yourself as a learner to your students. That this is the day in which all of us should be teachers, including our students. They should be teaching each other. They can be teaching us things. But as teachers, as educators, you should also be learning and showing your students that you are learning.
I would add one. If I mean, moderator. I don't have to ask your permission for anything. Write your questions down before you go in. A commitment for me, it's very easy to be a teacher in this space. And we're supposed to know a lot of stuff. But for me, I'm going to go to this session, and then the question is, what do I want to learn from that? And that's, if I could make a challenge as well, jump on that bandwagon, I would do that. And also, before we move, for those of you who are on Twitter, hopefully you are following the EduCon Twitter handle, not just the hashtag, but the handle itself. Becca and Ella, you're in the room, right? I would hope. Are you here? Right here. Becca and Ella, two SLA students who, throughout this entire panel, if you've been watching the EduCon handle, I was also listening. They've been doing all of the tweeting, and I think been doing a really amazing job. So if we could give them a round of applause as well. I want to thank Milton Chin, Franz Davis, Antero Garcia, and Stephanie Sandifer for a really wonderful conversation. Thank you for everything that you put up on Twitter. We didn't get to everything directly, but I tried to cast a wide net. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I think we're going to have a great couple of days. If you would please, as you exit here, you're going to hang a left, and in the planetarium, we will be having some food and drink, and hopefully some really good conversation. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for your kind attention. Oh my goodness. No.